Hello and welcome to the Business Interview. I'm Marcus Carlson. Today we're turning our attention to Africa. The continent's economies are still growing at a quicker rate than the rest of the world, but there are increasing warnings that West African economies will feel the squeeze of the Ebola outbreak in the region. Guinea, Liberia and Sierra Leone are the worst affected, and as the death toll rises, the World Bank warns that unless the disease is contained quickly, the economic impact will be devastating. How is the outbreak hitting businesses in the region, and what will it mean for the wider African growth story? Well, to help us answer those questions, we can now turn to Jean-Philippe Prosper. He's Vice President of Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America and the Caribbean at the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank. Welcome to the program, first of all.
Thank you very much.
For those of us who are unfamiliar with the IFC, what is it and what's your relationship with the World Bank, so to speak?
Well, IFC is a sister institution of the World Bank. We are part of the World Bank Group. IFC is the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. That means that we focus on the private sector. We have the same mission, which is, as said by our president, which is to eliminate extreme poverty by 2030 and build shared prosperity. But we do it in working, with the private sector.
So simply put, you work with the private sector. The World Bank perhaps focuses on governments.
That's correct. Simply put, we could summarize it like that.
Now, let's turn now then to the economic sentiment in West Africa in particular. The World Bank says that the Ebola outbreak will hit the economies of Guinea, Sierra Leone and Liberia particularly hard. Are you seeing an impact in those economies at this stage?
Well, yes, clearly. The bank has said we need, if we can contain that epidemic, within the next 6 months, we will be in what we call a low scenario, so low impact scenario. And that would mean in 2015, for those three economies combined, the impact will be about around $100 million, close to 97 estimated. However, if we are not able to contain it, then we can estimate that the impact could be, about $809 million or north of that. So basically, yes, it can be devastating.
You say that we're talking about a potentially devastating impact here. Where does that impact come from? From the fact that borders, to a certain extent, have been closed in order to contain the outbreak, the fact that people cannot assemble basically to go out and shop for their food, people are staying away from markets, or is it just the fear factor itself?
I think it's all of what you mentioned earlier, those things, when you measure them. However, the main cause is the fear factor. Let me give you some data that will put things in perspective. When you had the SARS in 2002 and 2004, or the H1N1 flu epidemic in 2009, analysts estimate that in both cases, the behavioral effects account for 80 to 90% of the impact of those crises. So in other words, people, if you don't, and that's what we said, if you don't contain, the epidemic, people will continue to have that behavioral effect that I don't go to that country, we close the borders, we do this, we do that. So you don't have exchange of goods and services, no business is going, no trade, no commerce, and that affects significantly, much more than thinking at the Ebola, because at the end of the day, when you look at it, the Ebola, if you had the proper health systems in place, you can contain it.
Could the economic impact that we are seeing in Sierra Leone, Guinea and also Liberia spread to other economies in the West African region?
Well, it depends on which economy. It can, of course, affect, but you have to look at each country, isolatedly. If we take the case, let's say Nigeria. First of all, Nigeria, what seems to be the good news is that they seem to be able to contain whatever the cases they have had so far. However, the other aspect that you have to look at in Nigeria, one of the biggest contributors to the GDP in Nigeria, it's, the oil sector, right? Energy and oil too. Now, this is primarily offshore, what they have. So regardless of the Ebola, the impact will be more limited, for example, because of that. However, as I said, containment is going to be essential. And the good news, I said also, in some of those countries, we even take the case of Senegal. And so far, they seem to have dealt pretty well with the one case that had been mentioned. And so, yes, but we are watching very carefully. And as I said, we haven't noticed any significant impact so far in the rest of West Africa.
I want to look at the wider African economy at the moment and sort of take the temperature of it. We've seen growth around about 5% in the past few years or so, and also the World Bank is projecting 4.7% growth for this year, for 2014. Where would you say that the African growth story is now? Because we've talked for a few years of this African growth story and its success, so to speak, or its growth, but how would you characterize it?
Oh, I still believe in the growth story. How could I characterize in the growth story is still there and is going to continue? The problem is that how sustainable is it going to be in the long term? I mean, you can have it again for the next 3 years, 4 years, but beyond that, what's going to happen? And I think part of it is going to be what the African government is going to do in the coming years. And by this, I mean primarily investing in certain areas like infrastructure. I mean, power, for example, electricity is dismal, what you have in terms of availability of electricity in Africa. And today, fortunately, a number of countries are taking the right steps, but we need to do much more than that and invest a lot in that. I can tell you for us at the IFC, this is one, if not our top priority on the African continent. And today we invest more than $1 billion a year in infrastructure, which about 3 years ago, we barely did about $200 million. And this is due also, thanks God, to some of the reforms that have taken place. Because before, people didn't invest in infrastructure, not because they didn't want to, because there's money to be made, there's a huge demand, but the environment, the regulatory structure wasn't there. Thanks to now the new World Bank group, the new approach that we are taking and working with a colleague from the bank, on the regulatory aspect, the regulatory reform, we are able to help change some of this framework, which allows us to bring more investments. I mean, take the case of Nigeria. IFC and the World Bank working together, we have developed what we call the energy business plan for Nigeria. And so we have worked a lot on the reforms, and the gas sector is being reformed, the electricity sector, and we are delivering, over the next 12 to 18 months, about 1,500 megawatts of new power generation. And we are working also on distribution, et cetera, et cetera.
Africa, of course, it's a big place, but if you were to identify a few countries that are the leaders of the African growth story, what would those countries be?
Well, you have to look at, when I say the countries, whether you think it depends of whether size and importance of growth. I mean, some countries are smaller and the growth story is there, but so I won't consider whether size or not. I'll talk about countries where you see the growth story happening and you see proper reforms happening. I would say, I mean, a country that I personally like a lot, and if you take Rwanda, it's still a small country. But when you look at the pace of reforms that they have taken today in the doing business, Rwanda was number 32 out of 189, while 7 years ago when we started working with them on the doing business reforms, they are 143. So this is a country where you can see the examples, and clearly, and that country is growing at the right pace, over 5%.
And beyond Rwanda?
Oh, yes. I was just taking that as an example. Now, if you take a country like Nigeria, Nigeria has its potential real growth story, as I mentioned. I mean, if you take other countries, for example, in East Africa, you have Kenya, Tanzania. Clearly, there is a growth potential, and there are good things happening. Look at Mozambique. That's another country where you see a number of things happening. So there are a number of countries where you can, if you look at Mauritania, if you look in West Africa, Francophone West Africa, a country like Ivory Coast, this is a really nice story. I mean, Ivory Coast today is growing almost double digits.
But if we look at a lot of the countries that you've mentioned, they're dependent on high commodity prices, especially the oil and the mining sector. What happens if those commodity prices come down? If, for instance, the Chinese economy slows down, what happens?
Well, clearly it will have an impact, but that doesn't mean that's the only thing happening. Because in those countries also, fortunately, some of them are taking the right measures. They are improving the infrastructure. A lot of investment is being done in transport, or in power, and we see more happening in the agribusiness sector thanks to some of those investments. And we see more happening also in services. I mean, financial sector, obviously, a lot happening there, but also in tourism in certain countries, like what if take East Africa in general or South Africa.
So the growth story is more broad-based?
The good story is more broad-based. Having said that, yes, we have to recognize that, yes, mining natural resources remain a big part of it. But what those countries have to do is to take advantage of what they have today and diversifying. So 5 years down the road, then they have a different story, and that's what we are trying to help them to do.
Is the pace of reform quick enough, essentially?
Well, there's so much to do that you will say the pace of reform is never good enough. Unless, as I said, you do like a ronda where you go to 142, 30, 143, for example, 32. I mean, I'm taking that as an exceptional example. However, having said that, yes, we have seen good reforms being taken place. In some countries, remember Africa, at the end of the day, it's a big continent. It's not one country. So in some countries, it goes faster than others. To give you an example, in the last 5 years, 18 out of the top 50 reformers, 18 of them are African countries, so which is kind of almost unheard of. So yes, there are a number of reforms taking place.
All right, Jean-Philippe Prosper from the IFC. We're going to have to wrap it up, though, because we have run out of time. Thank you very much indeed
My pleasure.
for speaking to us.
Thank you.
And with that, we're going to be wrapping up this edition of The Business Interview. Thanks for watching France 24.